she whispered. "No man has ever touched me." The cold billionaire CEO smirked and said, "Then let me." The espresso machine screamed. Not hissed, screamed, like metal, tearing against metal. Steam rising in desperate clouds toward the exposed brick ceiling. Natalie Brooks stood frozen at the mahogany counter, her fingers pressed so hard into the polished wood that her knuckles had gone white, bloodless, trembling. "I've never been touched by any man." The words had already left her mouth, already hung in the cold November air between her and Dominic Kane, the CEO. The impossible man, the one person she should have never, ever let see her like this. His eyes hadn't left hers, not for a second, not even to blink. "Then let me be the first." His voice had been low, rough, like gravel wrapped in velvet, and when he'd stepped closer, close enough that she could smell cedar and something darker, something that made her lungs forget how to work, Natalie had realized with terrible, crystalline clarity that her entire carefully constructed life was about to shatter. Because Dominic Kane didn't make empty promises, and she had just handed him the most dangerous truth she'd ever owned. The bass from the celebration party inside pulsed through the glass doors. Laughter, music, the clinking of champagne flutes. But out here on this balcony, suspended 40 stories above a city that glittered like broken glass, there was only silence. Only him. Only the moment before everything changed. Natalie's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought he could hear it, thought the entire city could hear it. She opened her mouth to take it back, to laugh it off, to say something, anything that would make this less real. But Dominic's hand was already moving toward her face. And she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stand there and watch her entire world tilt sideways. 3 hours earlier, Natalie Brooks had been absolutely certain of one thing. She was not going to Marco's promotion party. "I have a paper due," she texted him that morning, fingers flying across her phone screen while she waited for her marketing strategy lecture to start. "And you know I hate office parties." Marco's response had been immediate. "It's not an office party, it's a celebration of ME, your favorite colleague, your work husband, the person who covers for you when you're late because you stopped to pet every dog on campus." Natalie had smiled despite herself. That's emotional manipulation. "It's friendship. Also, I already told everyone you're coming, including my brother." Her smile had died instantly. "Why would you tell Dominic I'm coming?" "Because he asked if you were coming." "He doesn't even know me." "Exactly. Which is why you should come. Let him meet the woman who thinks he's an arrogant corporate overlord with a God complex." "I never said God complex." "You didn't have to. It was implied in your tone." 6 p.m. Don't make me beg." Natalie had stared at her phone for a long moment before typing back. "Fine, but I'm leaving early." She'd meant it too. She'd fully intended to show up, congratulate Marco, have one drink, maybe two, and then disappear before anyone noticed. Especially before Dominic Kane noticed. Dominic Kane, CEO of Kane Enterprises, Marco's older brother by 7 years. And according to every story Marco had ever told, the living embodiment of everything Natalie had spent her entire adult life avoiding. Rich, powerful, emotionally unavailable. The kind of man who treated relationships like mergers and acquisitions. Efficient, profitable, temporary. Marco had told her about the parade of socialites and models. 2 months, maybe 3 if they were lucky, and then Dominic would move on. Clean break, no hard feelings. Just business. Natalie had rolled her eyes every single time. Of course he treats people like quarterly earnings reports. That's what men like him do. They take what they want and leave when it stops being convenient. She'd seen it her whole life. Her mother, falling for man after man who promised the world and delivered nothing but empty closets and unpaid bills. Natalie had learned early. Love wasn't real, it was a transaction. And she refused to be currency. So she'd built walls, high ones, thick ones. Walls made of textbooks and career goals, and a stubborn refusal to need anyone. It had worked perfectly for 26 years. Until Marco's promotion party. Until the espresso. Until Dominic Kane walked through those glass doors and looked at her like she was an equation he couldn't solve. Natalie had already been 3 drinks in when he'd arrived. Or wait, was it 4? She'd lost count somewhere between Marco's tearful "thank you for being here" speech and the moment the room had gone quiet. Just for a second. Just long enough for everyone to register that he was there. Dominic Kane didn't enter rooms, he claimed them. Natalie had felt it before she'd seen him. That shift in the air. The way conversations paused mid-sentence. The way people straightened their postures, smoothed their clothes, arranged their faces into something more presentable. She'd turned, drink in hand, fully prepared to hate him on sight. And then she'd seen him. Charcoal suit, perfectly tailored. Dark hair that fell just slightly too long across his forehead, like he'd been too busy to get it cut but somehow made it look intentional. And eyes. God, those eyes. Gray like storm clouds. Like steel. Like something that could cut you open if you weren't careful. He'd been laughing at something a blonde woman said. That measured, controlled laugh that Marco had described. The kind that suggested he'd calculated exactly how many seconds of amusement were professionally appropriate. Natalie had hated him immediately. Not because of anything he'd done, but because looking at him made her feel something, and feeling things was dangerous. So she'd turned away, had pressed herself against the counter, and focused very hard on her drink, and absolutely not on the way her heart had started beating faster. "You good, Nat?" Marco had appeared beside her, concern creasing his usually cheerful face. He had been wearing a ridiculous party hat that said promoted and humble about it, and despite everything, Natalie had wanted to hug him. "Peachy," she'd said, and the word had come out slightly slurred. "I mean, I'm fine, just your espresso drinks are lethal. I told you to pace yourself." Marco had laughed, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. "Come on, let me get you some water and maybe some bread. Do you want bread? I have those little fancy crackers." "I'm fine," Natalie had insisted, pushing off the counter with more confidence than her wobbly legs warranted. "See? Totally fine. I'm just gonna get some air on the balcony where there's air. Want me to come with?" "Nope, I'm good. You go. Do birthday things. Wait, promotion things. Do promotion things." Natalie had navigated through the crowd with the careful precision of someone who knew she was drunk but was determined not to show it. She'd smiled at strangers, sidestepped the dancing couple, nearly tripped over someone's designer purse. The balcony doors had been blessedly close. She'd slipped outside into the cool November night, and the noise of the party had immediately softened to a muffled hum. The city had stretched out below, a glittering carpet of lights that made her head spin even more. Natalie had gripped the railing, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. "You're fine. You're fine. You just need a minute. And then you'll go back inside, drink water like a responsible adult, and pretend you didn't just spend 5 minutes staring at Marco's insufferable brother like he was something other than everything you've spent your life avoiding." Running away from the party already, Natalie's eyes had snapped open. Dominic Kane had been standing in the doorway, drink in hand, one eyebrow raised in what could only be described as amused condescension. Up close, he'd been even more unfairly attractive. Sharp jawline. Dark hair that fell just perfectly imperfect across his forehead. Eyes that were steel gray in the dim lighting, studying her with unsettling intensity. "I'm not running," Natalie had said, lifting her chin. "I'm appreciating the view." He'd stepped onto the balcony, closing the door behind him. The music had become even more distant. "You're Marco's friend, Natalie, right?" "Brooks, Natalie Brooks." Why had she said her full name like she was introducing herself at a job interview? "And you're Dominic Kane, corporate overlord and party crasher." His lips had twitched. "It's my brother's promotion party. I was invited." That's exactly what a crasher would say. Okay, she'd definitely been drunk. Sober Natalie would never sass a CEO. Sober Natalie avoided confrontation like it was her job. But drunk Natalie apparently had opinions. Dominic had leaned against the railing beside her, not too close, but close enough that she'd caught a hint of his cologne. Something expensive and woodsy that probably cost more than her rent. "You don't like me very much, do you?" he'd asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I don't know you. But you've already decided you don't like me." Natalie had turned to face him, the movement making her sway slightly. She'd grabbed the railing for support. "Marco talks about you a lot. You're the guy who dates socialites for exactly 2 months before moving on. The guy who acquired a competitor just because they undercut your bid. The guy who... Sounds like you've given me a lot of thought, Dominic had interrupted. And there had been something dangerous in his smile. Something that had made Natalie's stomach flip in a way that had nothing to do with the espresso. I haven't thought about you at all, she lied. Then why are you out here instead of inside enjoying the party? Maybe I wanted privacy. On my balcony. Marco's party. In your building. Natalie's head had been swimming again, but this time it hadn't been just the caffeine. Being this close to Dominic Kane had been doing strange things to her internal equilibrium. His presence had been overwhelming, confident, magnetic, infuriating. She'd needed to say something smart and cutting that would put him in his place. Instead, what had come out was, "I've never been touched by any man." The words had hung in the air between them like a confession she hadn't meant to make. Natalie's eyes had widened in horror. Had she really just said that? Out loud. To him. Dominic's expression had shifted. The amused smirk had faded, replaced by something more intense, more focused. He'd set his glass down on the railing with deliberate care, then turned to face her fully. "What did you say?" His voice had been lower now, quieter. Natalie's face had burned. "Nothing. I didn't. I'm drunk. Forget I said anything." She'd tried to step past him, back toward the door, but her heel had caught on absolutely nothing, and she'd stumbled forward. Dominic had caught her. His hands had been firm on her waist, steadying her, and Natalie had found herself pressed against his chest, looking up into those impossibly gray eyes. "Careful," he'd murmured. They'd been so close she could see the darker ring around his irises, could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell that stupid expensive cologne that was making her head spin even more. "I need to go," Natalie had whispered. But she hadn't moved. Dominic's thumb had brushed against her waist, a small, almost unconscious gesture that had sent electricity shooting through her entire body. "You said," he'd begun slowly, his gaze never leaving hers, "that you've never been touched by any man." "I was drunk talking. It doesn't count." "Were you lying?" Natalie had swallowed hard. Every instinct had screamed at her to push away, to laugh it off, to salvage what was left of her dignity, but his hands had still been on her waist, and he'd been looking at her like she was the only person in the entire city. "No," she'd admitted quietly, "I wasn't lying." Something had changed in his expression, a heat that hadn't been there before. His hands had tightened slightly on her waist, pulling her infinitesimally closer. "Then let me be the first," Dominic had said, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like reverence. Natalie's breath had caught. Her heart had hammered against her ribs so hard she'd been certain he could feel it. This had been insane. She'd been drunk. He'd been arrogant. They'd known each other for exactly 5 minutes, and most of that time she'd spent insulting him. And yet, "You don't even know me," Natalie had whispered. "I'd like to. You date socialites for 2 months, then move on. Maybe I'm ready for something different." "You're supposed to be a cold CEO who only cares about quarterly reports." Dominic's lips had curved into a smile. A real one this time, not the polished boardroom version. "And you're supposed to be a woman who doesn't think about me at all. Yet here we are." Natalie had opened her mouth to respond, but the balcony door had suddenly swung open. "There you are." Marco had burst onto the balcony, holding the bottle of champagne. "Natalie, you have to come inside. We're doing..." He'd stopped abruptly, taking in the scene. Dominic's hands on Natalie's waist, the minimal distance between them, the charged atmosphere. "Oh," Marco had said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Oh. Am I interrupting something?" Dominic had stepped back smoothly, his hands falling away from Natalie's waist, leaving her feeling strangely cold. "Just making sure your colleague didn't fall over the railing," he'd said casually, as if the last 3 minutes hadn't happened at all. Natalie had forced a laugh that had sounded mildly hysterical even to her own ears. "Yep, just vertigo. From the height. And the espresso. Mostly the espresso." Marco had looked between them, clearly not buying it, but before he could comment, someone had called his name from inside. "Coming," Marco had shouted back, then pointed at Natalie. "You! Inside! Now!" He'd pointed at Dominic. "You! Stop being mysterious on balconies, it's creepy. He'd disappeared back into the party, leaving the door open. Natalie had smoothed down her blouse, suddenly hyper-aware of every wrinkle, every hair out of place. I should. Natalie. She'd looked up. Dominic had been watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. This conversation isn't over, he'd said quietly. It hadn't been a threat, it had been a promise. Natalie's heart had done another one of those annoying flips. I don't even have your number. You will. The confidence in those two words should have been off-putting. Should have confirmed every cold CEO stereotype she'd built up in her head. Instead, it had sent a thrill down her spine. Without another word, Natalie had turned and walked back into the celebration, keenly aware of Dominic's gaze following her every step. She'd made it exactly 3 feet into the cafe before Marco had pounced. Spill everything, now. There's nothing to spill, Natalie had insisted, grabbing a water bottle from the nearby cooler with shaking hands. You were pressed against my brother on the balcony, Nat. That is definitely something. I stumbled. He caught me. That's it. You're a terrible liar. I'm a drunk liar. There's a difference. Marco had opened his mouth to argue, but someone had cranked the music louder, and he'd gotten dragged toward the makeshift karaoke setup. Natalie had taken the opportunity to escape to the bathroom, locking the door behind her and staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her cheeks had been flushed, her eyes too bright, and she could still feel the ghost of Dominic's hands on her waist. Then let me be the first. She groaned, splashing cold water on her face. This had been a disaster, a complete and total disaster. She didn't date. She didn't do romance. And she definitely didn't fall for cold CEOs who looked at her like she was a puzzle they wanted to solve. Natalie Brooks had a plan, a good plan, a safe plan. Finish her marketing certification, climb the corporate ladder, build a life that was predictable and secure and completely under her control. Men like Dominic Kane, charismatic, intense, overwhelming, were the opposite of safe. They were chaos wrapped in expensive suits. She didn't need chaos. So why couldn't she stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her? Natalie had dried her face with a paper towel, taken a deep breath, and opened the bathroom door. Dominic had been standing in the hallway, leaning against the wall like he'd been waiting for her. We need to talk, he'd said. We really don't. You can't say something like that and expect me to just walk away. Natalie's pulse had quickened. I was drunk. I still am a little. People say stupid things when they're drunk. It wasn't stupid. Dominic had pushed off the wall, closing the distance between them. Not touching, but close enough that Natalie had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. It was honest. You don't know that. I do. The certainty in his voice had been maddening. You're so arrogant. You've mentioned that. It's not a compliment. I know. They'd stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Give me one chance, Dominic had said finally. One date. Let me prove I'm not whatever version of me Marcos told you about. And if I say no, his jaw had tightened, then I'll respect that. But I don't think you will. Because you're used to getting what you want. Because you felt it too, on that balcony, whatever this is between us. Natalie had hated that he was right. Hated that her traitorous heart was screaming at her to say yes. Hated that some small, reckless part of her wanted to see what would happen if she let Dominic Kane be the first man to touch her. To know her. One date, she'd heard herself say, but I'm picking the place, and you're not allowed to buy out the entire restaurant or do any CEO power moves. Dominic's smile had been slow and devastating. Deal. He'd pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and handed it to her. Your number. Natalie's fingers had trembled slightly as she typed in her contact information. She'd handed the phone back, and Dominic's thumb had brushed against hers in the exchange. That small, innocent touch had sent heat racing through her veins. This had been dangerous. He had been dangerous. But when Dominic had looked at her like that, like she was something precious and rare, Natalie had found she didn't care. I'll text you tomorrow, he'd said. I might not answer. You will. Before Natalie could respond, he'd turned and walked away, disappearing back into the party with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Natalie had leaned against the wall, her knees weak, her mind reeling. What had she just agreed to? Natalie's phone had buzzed at exactly 8:23 in the morning. She'd known the exact time because she'd been staring at her ceiling for the past 2 hours, replaying every mortifying second of last night's balcony confession on an endless loop. "I've never been touched by any man." She'd grabbed her pillow and screamed into it. Who said that? To a stranger. To a devastatingly attractive CEO stranger who probably had a waiting list of sophisticated women who knew how to handle their caffeine and didn't blurt out their deepest secrets within 5 minutes of meeting someone. Her phone had buzzed again. Natalie had reached for it with the enthusiasm of someone defusing a bomb, squinting at the bright screen. "Good morning. This is Dominic. I hope your head isn't hurting too badly. I'm serious about that date, Saturday, unless you'd prefer sooner. Fair warning, I don't do well with waiting." Natalie had stared at the messages, her heart doing that annoying flutter thing again. He'd actually texted. She'd half convinced herself that last night had been some kind of caffeine-induced fever dream. Her thumbs had hovered over the keyboard. What had been the protocol here? Play it cool, be honest, pretend she didn't remember anything, and hope he'd drop it. Before she could overthink it further, another text had come through. "You're overthinking this. I can practically feel it through the phone." Natalie had sat up so fast her head had spun. How did he? "I'm not overthinking," she'd typed back. "I'm thinking at a normal pace." "That's definitely overthinking." "You don't know me well enough to make that assessment." "Then let me get to know you. Saturday, 7 p.m. I said I was picking the place." "So pick." Natalie had bitten her lip, thinking. Every fiber of her being had wanted to choose somewhere casual, somewhere that would keep this whole thing firmly in the not-a-big-deal category. Sal's Pizza, on Lexington and 42nd. There had been a pause. Natalie had imagined Dominic Googling the place, seeing the plastic booths and grease-stained menus, the complete absence of anything resembling fancy. "Perfect. I'll pick you up at 6:30. I can meet you there." "Natalie." "Dominic. Let me pick you up, please." The police had done something to her insides. "Fine, but only because Sal's has terrible parking. Whatever helps you sleep at night. I'll need your address." Natalie had sent it, then immediately panicked. He'd see her apartment building. Her tiny, cramped, definitely not penthouse apartment building with the flickering stairwell lights and the elevator that only worked half the time. "Got it. See you Saturday, Natalie Brooks." The use of her full name had made her smile despite herself. Natalie's apartment had been a one-bedroom in a building that charitably could be called vintage and realistically should be called one inspection away from condemnation. But it had been hers. Every mismatched piece of furniture, every plant she'd somehow managed not to kill, every stack of marketing textbooks that turned her coffee table into a miniature library. She'd moved there 3 years ago, fresh out of undergrad, determined to make it on her own. No family money, no safety net. Just student loans, 2 part-time jobs, and a stubborn refusal to ask for help. Her marketing certification program had been the dream, the plan, the thing that kept her going through double shifts at the bookstore and weekend freelance gigs. Business had made sense to Natalie. It had been logical, strategic. You put in the work, you got results. No messy emotions, no unpredictable variables. Which had been exactly why she'd avoided relationships entirely. "You're being ridiculous," she told her reflection on Saturday afternoon, standing in front of her closet in her underwear for the 3rd time in an hour. "It's just pizza." At Sal's. With a man who looks like he walked out of a cologne commercial and probably has a dating resume longer than your bibliography. Her phone had rung. Marco's face had filled the screen, mid-bite of what had looked like a sandwich. "Tell me you're not canceling," Marco had said, through a mouthful of turkey. "I'm thinking about it." "Don't you dare. Dom hasn't stopped asking about you." Natalie's stomach had flipped. "He has not." "He texted me 4 times yesterday asking what you like. Flowers, food, music, favorite color. I felt like I was filling out a dating profile questionnaire." "That's weird, right? That's objectively weird." "That's my brother being serious about someone for the first time in forever." Marco had swallowed his bite. Nat, I love you, but you need to stop catastrophizing. Go on the date. Have fun. See what happens. What if I mess it up? Then you mess it up. But at least you tried. Natalie had pulled out a simple burgundy sweater, holding it up to herself. Is this too nice for Sal's? Their napkins are paper towels, babe. Exactly, so maybe I should wear jeans. Wear the sweater. You look amazing in that sweater. Dom's gonna lose his mind. I don't want him to lose his mind. I want him to have a nice, normal dinner and realize I'm actually very boring. Marco had laughed. You're many things, Natalie Brooks, but boring isn't one of them. Now get dressed and text me after. I want details. There won't be details. There better be details. After Marco had hung up, Natalie had stared at the sweater for another long moment before pulling it on. It had fit perfectly, hugging her curves without being too tight, the neckline modest but flattering. She'd added simple jewelry, minimal makeup. Her dark blonde hair had fallen in soft waves past her shoulders, and she'd managed to tame the frizz that usually defied all attempts at control. Looking at herself in the mirror, Natalie had barely recognized the woman staring back. She'd looked confident, pretty, like someone who went on dates with attractive CEOs, even if inside she'd felt like a nervous wreck. At exactly 6:30 p.m., her building's buzzer had rung. Natalie had grabbed her purse, taken one last steadying breath, and headed downstairs. Dominic had been standing in the lobby, and Natalie's steps had faltered. He'd worn dark jeans and a charcoal Henley that had somehow looked both casual and expensive. His hair had been slightly disheveled, like he'd run his hands through it, and when he'd seen her descending the stairs, his entire face had transformed. Wow, he'd said softly. Natalie's cheeks had heated. It's just a sweater. It's not just a sweater. Dominic had closed the distance between them, his eyes never leaving hers. You look beautiful. You look not like a CEO. He'd laughed, that deep, genuine laugh that had done dangerous things to her pulse. I can be normal sometimes. I'll believe it when I see it. Dominic had offered his arm. Natalie had hesitated for only a second before taking it, trying to ignore how natural it had felt. How right. His car had been parked outside, a sleek black Audi that probably cost more than Natalie's entire education. This is you being normal, Natalie had asked as Dominic had opened the passenger door for her. Would you have preferred I show up in a limo? I would have preferred you show up in something that didn't scream, I have more money than sense. I'll make a note for next time. Bold of you to assume there will be a next time. Dominic's smile had been dangerous. I'm an optimist. The drive to Sal's had taken 15 minutes. Dominic had asked about her week, her classes, her favorite books. Natalie had found herself answering honestly, surprised by how easy he'd been to talk to when he hadn't been being arrogant. Marketing certification, Dominic had repeated, glancing at her. So you want to go into branding, strategy. Eventually, I want to open my own consulting firm. Something small, boutique, focused on helping local businesses build authentic brand identities instead of just chasing trends. Natalie had paused. Sorry, I'm rambling. Don't apologize. I like listening to you talk about things you care about. He'd pulled into Sal's parking lot, which had been, as Natalie had warned, completely full. Tell me more, Dominic had said, about the consulting firm, about you. Natalie had bitten her lip. That's a very broad question. Start anywhere. So she had. She'd told him about growing up with a single mom who'd worked 3 jobs, about putting herself through undergrad on scholarships and sheer determination, about the mentor who'd encouraged her to pursue her certification when she'd been ready to give up. She hadn't usually shared her history with people. It had felt too vulnerable, too much like asking for pity. But Dominic hadn't looked at her with pity. He'd looked at her with something closer to admiration. That's incredible, he'd said quietly. You built your entire career from scratch. I didn't have much choice. You had every choice. You could have given up. But you didn't. He turned off the car, shifting to face her fully. That takes strength most people don't have. Natalie's throat had tightened. What about you? What's the Dominic Kane origin story? His expression had shifted, become more guarded, much less interesting. Born into money, raised to take over the family business. Did exactly that. That's the corporate bio version. What's the real version? Dominic had been quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The real version is that my father built Kane Enterprises from nothing. He was brilliant and ruthless and completely absent from my childhood. When he died 5 years ago, I inherited a company and a legacy I wasn't sure I wanted. But you took it anyway. I did. Why? Because it was what everyone expected. And because I thought, if I could just be successful enough, prove myself enough, maybe I'd figure out what I actually wanted. He'd laughed, but it had sounded hollow. Still working on that last part. Natalie had studied him, really studied him. Without the arrogant smirk and CEO armor, Dominic had looked younger. More uncertain. More human. For what it's worth, Natalie had said softly, "I think you're more than just your last name." Dominic's gaze had locked onto hers, intense and searching. "No one's ever said that to me before." "Then you've been spending time with the wrong people." The air between them had thickened with something Natalie couldn't quite name. Dominic had reached across the center console, his hand hovering near hers. "Can I?" "We should go inside," Natalie had interrupted, pulling her hand back, "before they give away our table." Dominic's hand had dropped, but his eyes had lingered on her face for another long moment before he'd nodded. He'd come around to open her door, offering his hand to help her out. This time Natalie had taken it. His palm had been warm against hers, solid, safe. Dangerous, her brain had supplied, but she hadn't let go. Sal's Pizza had been exactly as Natalie had remembered. Bright overhead lights, cracked vinyl booths, and the smell of garlic and oregano that had somehow felt like home. Natalie. Sal himself had emerged from behind the counter, arms wide. He'd been in his 60s with gray hair and a smile that could warm the coldest heart. "Bella, I haven't seen you in weeks." Natalie had hugged him tight. "I've been drowning in coursework, Sal, but I'm here now." "And you brought a friend." Sal's sharp eyes had assessed Dominic with the precision of someone who'd seen every type of person walk through his doors. "A very handsome friend." "This is Dominic," Natalie had said, feeling her face heat. "Dominic, this is Sal. He makes the best pizza in the city." "In the world," Sal had corrected, shaking Dominic's hand with a grip that had made him blink. "You treat our Natalie right, you hear me, or you'll answer to me." "Yes, sir," Dominic had said, and he'd sounded genuinely intimidated. Natalie had bitten her smile. Sal had led them to a booth in the back corner, the same one Natalie had always sat in when she'd come there to study. She'd slid into the familiar seat, and Dominic had sat across from her, looking hilariously out of place in his expensive casual wear. So Dominic had said, picking up the laminated menu, "What's good here?" "Everything. But especially the margarita and the garlic knots." "Margarita it is." When their waitress had come, a college student named Maria, who Natalie had recognized from campus, they'd ordered. Dominic had asked for exactly what Natalie had suggested, and she'd found herself unreasonably pleased by that. "You come here a lot?" Dominic had asked after Maria had left. "At least once a week. Sal lets me sit for hours nursing one slice while I study. He says I remind him of his daughter." Natalie had traced a finger along a crack in the table. "I don't have much family, so Sal kind of fills that space." Dominic's expression had softened. "He seems protective of you." "He is. When I first started coming here, I was this scared 20-year-old who just started college. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and sat in that corner booth, trying not to cry. Sal brought me a full pizza and told me it was on the house. Said he could spot someone who needed kindness from a mile away. He was right." Natalie had looked up, meeting Dominic's gaze. "I didn't need charity." "That's not what I meant. I meant he saw something in you worth protecting, worth caring about." He'd leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I see it too." Natalie's breath had caught. "Dominic, I know you think I'm this cold CEO who treats people like business transactions. And maybe I was. Maybe I still am sometimes. But you," he'd shaken his head, "you're different. You don't know me well enough to say that. Then let me get to know you." Their food had arrived before Natalie could respond. The pizza had been perfectly golden, the garlic knots steaming and fragrant. Dominic had taken a bite, and his eyes had widened. "Okay," he'd admitted, "this is the best pizza I've ever had." "Told you." They'd eaten and talked, and Natalie had found herself relaxing in a way she'd rarely done around new people. Dominic had asked questions, real questions, not small talk, and he'd actually listened to her answers. He'd laughed at her stories about her disastrous first marketing presentation, where she'd accidentally displayed her personal Pinterest board instead of her pitch deck. In return, he told her about board meetings that had gone hilariously wrong, about his assistant who had mothered him relentlessly, about his complete inability to keep houseplants alive. "I've killed 7 succulents," Dominic had confessed. 7. They're supposed to be impossible to kill. That's actually impressive, in the worst way. I'm aware. By the time they'd finished eating, Natalie's sides had hurt from laughing. Dominic had long since abandoned any pretense of CEO formality. His smile had been easy, his laugh frequent, and when he'd looked at her, it had been like she was the only person in the entire world. It had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Can I ask you something?" Dominic had said as they'd waited for the check. "You just did." "Smartass." But he'd been smiling. "The other night, what you said about never being touched by a man, did you mean?" Natalie's cheeks had flamed. "Yes. I meant exactly what you think I meant." Dominic had been quiet, processing. "Can I ask why? That's a very personal question for a first date." "Everything about this feels personal." He hadn't been wrong. Natalie had taken a breath, choosing her words carefully. "I grew up watching my mom get her heart broken over and over. Every boyfriend promised the world, then left when things got hard. Love always seemed like a transaction, something people took when it was convenient and discarded when it wasn't. She'd met his eyes. I didn't want to be discarded, so I just never let anyone close enough to do it." Dominic had reached across the table, palm up, an invitation, not a demand. Natalie had stared at his hand for a long moment before slowly placing hers in it. His fingers had closed around hers gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I won't discard you," Dominic had said quietly. "I don't know what this is between us yet, but I promise you, Natalie Brooks, I won't treat you like a transaction." Natalie's heart had hammered against her ribs. "That's a big promise." "I don't make promises I can't keep." They'd sat like that, hands intertwined across the table, until Maria had brought the check. Dominic had paid despite Natalie's protests, leaving a tip that had made Maria's eyes go wide. As they'd walked to his car, Dominic had kept hold of Natalie's hand. It had felt natural, right, like they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. "Thank you," Natalie had said as he'd opened her door, "for tonight, for listening, for everything. Thank you for giving me a chance." Dominic had stepped closer, and Natalie's breath had hitched. "Can I see you again?" "Maybe. Maybe yes, or maybe no. Maybe I need to think about it." Dominic had smiled, but there'd been something vulnerable in it. "Fair enough. Think fast, though. I don't do well with waiting. Remember." "You mentioned that." He'd driven her home, and they talked the entire way about movies, music, embarrassing childhood stories. When they'd pulled up to her building, Natalie had felt a pang of disappointment that the night was ending. Dominic had walked her to her door like the gentleman Marco had insisted he could be when he wanted to. "This is me," Natalie had said, gesturing to her apartment building's entrance. I gathered Dominic had shown no signs of leaving. "Will you text me? Let me know you got inside safely." "I'm going inside right now." "You'll literally watch me get inside safely?" "Humor me." Natalie had rolled her eyes but had pulled out her phone. "Fine, I'll text you." "Good." They'd stood there, neither moving, the air thick with possibility. "I should," Natalie had started. "Can I kiss you?" Dominic had blurted, then had looked almost surprised he'd said it out loud. Natalie's heart had stopped. "What?" "Can I kiss you?" he'd repeated, slower this time. "I've been thinking about it all night, but only if you want to." "Yes," Natalie had whispered. Dominic had stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. His touch had been gentle, reverent, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. Natalie hadn't. When his lips had met hers, it had been soft and sweet and absolutely devastating. He'd kissed her like she was something precious, something worth savoring. Natalie's hands had found his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing beneath her palms. The kiss had deepened slightly, and she'd felt herself melting into him, into this moment, into the terrifying possibility of letting someone in. When they'd finally pulled apart, both breathless, Dominic had rested his forehead against hers. "Definitely seeing you again," he'd murmured. Natalie had laughed, still dizzy, arrogant. "Confident. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes, because this time I know you feel it too." And damn it, he'd been right. Natalie floated through the next week in a haze that Marco delighted in calling disgustingly romantic. "You're humming," Marco had pointed out during their Tuesday coffee date, waving his biscotti at her like an accusation. "You never hum." "I hum sometimes." "Name one time before this week that you've hummed." Natalie had opened her mouth, then closed it. "Fine, maybe I'm in a good mood." "You've texted Dom 63 times since Saturday. I know because I checked his phone." "You're counting my texts." "I'm living vicariously through your texts." "There's a difference." Marco had stirred his latte with exaggerated nonchalance. "So, Wednesday's date number 2. Tomorrow night. He's taking me to some art gallery opening." Jenna's eyebrows had shot up. "Fancy. Too fancy." "I told him I'd feel more comfortable at another diner." And he said we'd go to both. Diner first, gallery after, so I could ease into the fancy. Natalie hadn't been able to help the smile that had spread across her face. He's thoughtful. He's smitten, there's a difference. Natalie's phone had buzzed on the table. Both of them had looked at it. Question: how do you feel about Italian food? Positive feelings. Why? Making dinner reservations for Friday. Unless you'd prefer, I cook. You cook. I make a mean bowl of cereal. Natalie had laughed out loud, drawing looks from nearby tables. Restaurant it is then. Probably for the best. My kitchen has been classified as a biohazard zone. Also, I miss you. Natalie's chest had tightened in that now familiar way. It had only been 3 days since their first date, but she'd missed him too. The realization had been both wonderful and terrifying. See you tomorrow night. Counting the hours. Marco had been watching her with a knowing smile. You're blushing. I am not. You absolutely are. Your entire face is red. Natalie had covered her cheeks with her hands. This is moving too fast, isn't it? Fast compared to what? Your previous dating history of absolutely nothing. Marco had reached across the table, squeezing her arm. Babe, you're allowed to be happy. You're allowed to let someone in. But what if? No what ifs. Not yet. Just enjoy this. Natalie had tried. She really had. But years of self-preservation didn't evaporate after one good date and a few sweet text messages. Every time Dominic had said something kind, every time he'd texted just to check in, every time he'd looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life, Natalie had waited for the other shoe to drop. Because good things didn't happen to girls like her, girls who'd grown up watching their mothers get abandoned, girls who'd eaten dinner alone in their studio apartments, girls who'd built walls so high that even they sometimes forgot what it felt like to let someone climb them. But Dominic was already halfway up those walls. And Natalie wasn't sure whether to help him or push him off. Wednesday evening, Dominic had picked her up at 6 sharp. Natalie had agonized over her outfit for 2 hours before settling on black jeans, a cream-colored blouse, and the same simple jewelry from their first date. Casual enough for the diner, nice enough for an art gallery. When she'd opened her apartment door, Dominic had been holding a single sunflower. You said roses were too cliché, he'd explained, looking almost nervous. And I remembered you mentioned you like sunflowers. You said they always look happy. Natalie had stared at the flower, then at him, feeling something crack open in her chest. When did I say that? Tuesday. You were talking about the flower shop near campus. You said sunflowers always look happy, even in crappy weather. You remember that. I remember everything you tell me. Natalie had taken the sunflower with hands that weren't quite steady. Come inside for a second. I need to put this in water. Dominic had followed her into her tiny apartment, and Natalie had been suddenly hyper-aware of how small her space was. The single bedroom that barely fit her full-size bed, the kitchenette that could barely fit one person, the bathroom door that stuck unless you knew the exact angle to push it. But Dominic hadn't looked uncomfortable. He'd looked curious. "This is nice," he'd said, studying her bookshelf. "Very you." "You mean cramped and chaotic." "I mean cozy and lived in." He'd picked up a framed photo from her desk. Natalie with a group of students from her practicum, all making silly faces at the camera. "Is this your class?" "Last semester's practicum. Marketing students. They were a handful." "You look happy." Natalie had glanced at the photo. She had looked happy. Genuinely, unreservedly happy in a way she'd rarely felt anywhere else. "Students are easy," Natalie had said, filling a mug with water for the sunflower. "Adults are complicated. Present company included." She'd met his eyes. "Especially present company." Dominic had set down the photo, moving closer. "What's complicated about me?" "Where do I start?" Natalie had counted on her fingers. "You're a CEO. You're absurdly wealthy. You're confident to the point of arrogance. You text me like we've known each other for years instead of days. You remember random things I say and show up with my favorite flowers. You look at me like..." She'd stopped. "Like what?" "Like I'm someone worth looking at." Dominic had closed the remaining distance between them, his hands coming to rest on her hips. "Natalie, you are absolutely someone worth looking at. Worth knowing, worth..." He'd paused. "Can I be honest? I'd prefer it. I haven't felt this way about anyone in a very long time, maybe ever. And it scares the hell out of me because I barely know you, but somehow I can't imagine not knowing you." His thumbs had traced small circles against her hip bones through her blouse. "Tell me I'm not crazy. Tell me you feel something too." Natalie's breath had come shallow. "You're not crazy. That's not the same as saying you feel something." She'd reached up, letting her fingers trace the line of his jaw. Dominic's eyes had fluttered closed at the touch. "I feel something," Natalie had whispered. "I feel a lot of something. And it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone in without it destroying me when they leave." Dominic's eyes had opened, and the intensity in them had made Natalie's knees weak. "What makes you think I'm going to leave?" "Everyone leaves eventually." "Not everyone. Not me." He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "I'm not going anywhere, Natalie Brooks. You're stuck with me. You can't promise that. Watch me." He'd kissed her then, and it had been different from their first kiss. Deeper, more urgent, full of all the things neither of them quite knew how to say out loud. Natalie's hands had slid into his hair, pulling him closer. Dominic had made a sound low in his throat, one hand moving to cup the back of her neck while the other had stayed firm on her hip. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Dominic had rested his cheek against the top of her head. "We should go," he'd murmured, "before I forget we have dinner reservations." "Would that be so terrible?" She'd felt him smile against her hair. "Absolutely not. But I promised you a proper date, and I keep my promises." Natalie had pulled back reluctantly. "Fine, but only because I'm hungry." Liar. You're hungry for something, but it's not food. Arrogant. Accurate. They'd made it to the diner by 7, and this time, when they'd walked in holding hands, Sal's knowing smile had been even wider. "Back again so soon," he'd said, leading them to the same booth. Must have been a good first date. The best, Dominic had said, and he'd sounded so sincere that Natalie's heart had done that annoying flutter thing again. They'd ordered margarita pizza for Natalie, a calzone for Dominic, and had fallen into easy conversation. Dominic had told her about a disastrous board meeting where the projector had malfunctioned, and he'd ended up presenting an entire quarterly report using hand-drawn stick figures on a whiteboard. The board members were not amused, Dominic had said, stealing one of Natalie's garlic knots. "My assistant found it hilarious." "I'm with your assistant." "Of course you are." Natalie had told him about her classes, about the research paper she was writing on consumer psychology and brand loyalty, about the consulting firm she dreamed of opening someday. "I want it to feel like a partnership," Natalie had explained, her eyes lighting up the way they always did when she talked about this. "Not like I'm some distant expert telling them what to do. Somewhere small businesses feel heard, where we build their brands together based on what makes them unique." Dominic had watched her with an expression Natalie couldn't quite read. "You're gonna change lives." "That's the goal." "No, I mean it. You're gonna change lives because you care. Really care. Not just about the theory or the strategy, but about the actual people, about making them feel valued. He'd reached across the table, taking her hand. "That's rare, Natalie. Don't let anyone tell you it's not." Natalie's throat had tightened. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" "I don't. I just say what I'm thinking when I'm with you." His thumb had brushed across her knuckles. "You make it easy, to be honest." After dinner, they'd driven to the Gallery, a sleek space in the downtown arts district that Natalie had walked past 100 times but never entered. "I feel underdressed," Natalie had whispered as they'd walked in, taking in the elegant crowd sipping champagne and discussing abstract paintings. "You look perfect," Dominic had said firmly, "and anyone who thinks otherwise can deal with me. My knight in designer jeans." "Damn right." They'd wandered through the gallery, and Natalie had found herself actually enjoying it. Dominic had explained the pieces in a way that had made them accessible rather than pretentious. And when he'd caught her staring at a particular painting, a woman standing at the edge of the ocean looking out at the horizon, he'd squeezed her hand. "What are you thinking?" he'd asked. "That she looks brave and scared at the same time, like she's standing at the edge of something unknown." "Yeah." Dominic had turned her to face him right there in the middle of the gallery. "You're brave, you know, braver than you think." "I don't feel brave." "Because brave people never do. They just do the scary thing anyway." Natalie had looked up at him, at this man who'd somehow slipped past all her defenses in less than a week, and had felt that terrifying free-fall sensation of letting go. Dominic. Her phone had rung, shrill and insistent. Natalie had fumbled it out of her purse, ready to silence it, but the name on the screen had made her freeze. "St. Mary's Hospital." "I have to take this," Natalie had said, already moving toward the exit. Dominic had followed without question. "Hello." "Is this Natalie Brooks?" A woman's voice, professional and calm. "Yes, this is Natalie." "Miss Brooks, this is Nurse Chen from St. Mary's Hospital. You're listed as the emergency contact for Salvatore Martinez." Natalie's world had tilted. "Sal, what happened? Is he okay?" "Mr. Martinez suffered a heart attack this evening. He's stable now, but he's asking for you. Can you come to the hospital?" "Yes. Yes, I'm coming right now." Natalie had already been moving toward Dominic's car. "Which room?" "Cardiac care unit, room 412. Ask for me at the desk when you arrive." Natalie had hung up, her hands shaking. "It's Sal. He had a heart attack. I need to get to the hospital." "I'll drive you." Dominic had already been unlocking the car. "St. Mary's?" "Yes." The drive had taken 12 minutes that had felt like 12 hours. Natalie's leg had bounced anxiously, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Dominic had driven with focused efficiency, one hand on the wheel and the other finding hers. "He's gonna be okay," he'd said. "You don't know that." "No, but I know Sal's tough. He threatened me on our first date, remember?" Dominic had managed a weak laugh. "Anyone who can put the fear of God into me with just a look is too stubborn to let a heart attack win." They'd reached the hospital, and Dominic had pulled up to the emergency entrance. "Go, I'll park and find you." "You don't have to." "Natalie." "I'll be right behind you." Natalie had run inside, her heels clicking against the linoleum as she'd found the cardiac care unit. Nurse Chen, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, had met her at the desk. "He's resting, but he's been asking for you every 5 minutes." Nurse Chen had said, leading Natalie down the hallway. "Try to keep him calm. Stress isn't good for him right now." "I will." Room 412 had been at the end of the hall. Natalie had pushed open the door, and her heart had broken at the sight. Sal had looked so small in the hospital bed, his skin pale against the white sheets, monitors beeping steadily beside him, but his eyes had been open. And when he'd seen Natalie, his face had crumpled. "Baby girl." Natalie had been at his side in an instant, taking Sal's hand carefully. "I'm here. I'm right here." "Scared me," Sal had rasped. And Natalie had never heard his voice sound so fragile. "Scared me real bad." "You scared me too. What happened?" Was closing up the diner, felt this pain in my chest, couldn't breathe. Sal's grip had tightened on Natalie's hand. Felt that was it. Thought I was done. "You're not done. You're gonna be fine." Doctor said I need surgery. Something about my heart. They weren't real specific. Sal's eyes had filled with tears. "Who's gonna run the diner?" "Don't worry about the diner right now. Just focus on getting better." Can't close it. It's all I got. All I built. Sal's voice had gained strength, that familiar stubborn edge returning. Promise me. Promise me you won't let them close my diner. Natalie's throat had closed up, I promise. Need you to run it while I'm recovering. You know how everything works. You've watched me enough times. I have classes, Sal. My certification program. I know, baby. I know. But I'm asking anyway. Sal's tears had spilled over. You're the only family I got. The only one I trust with my place. Natalie had felt her own tears threatening. Okay, I'll do it. Whatever you need. Sal had sagged back against the pillows, relief washing over his features. Thank you, baby girl. There had been a soft knock on the door. Dominic had stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. I'm sorry to interrupt, he'd said quietly. I brought coffee, thought you might need it. Sal's eyes had sharpened, despite his exhaustion, the handsome one from the diner. Dominic, sir, we met on Saturday. I remember. You treat our Natalie right. Doing my best. Sal had looked between them, and something like satisfaction had crossed his face. Good. She needs someone who sees her. Sal, Natalie had protested weakly. Hush. I'm sick. I get to say what I want. Sal's eyes had drifted closed, his breathing evening out. Stay with me a bit. As long as you need. Natalie had sat beside Sal's bed, holding his hand as the older man had dozed. Dominic had settled into the chair by the window, and when Natalie had looked at him, really looked at him, he hadn't been on his phone or fidgeting or showing any signs of impatience. He'd just been there, steady and present and exactly what she'd needed. Hours had passed. Nurses had come and gone. Eventually, Nurse Chen had gently told them visiting hours were over, but that Sal was stable and sleeping peacefully. Come back tomorrow, she'd said kindly. He'll want to see you. Natalie had let Dominic lead her out to the parking lot. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright had drained away all at once, leaving her feeling hollowed out. I don't know how to run a diner, Natalie had said, staring at nothing. I barely know how to cook, and I have classes and papers and my practicum. Hey! Dominic had turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. One thing at a time. I can't do this. I can't run Sal's and keep up with school. And you don't have to do it alone. Natalie had looked up at him. What? You don't have to do it alone. I'll help you. Dominic, you run a company. You can't. I have a very capable management team who can handle things while I take some time. And before you argue, this isn't charity or pity or whatever you're thinking. His hands had moved to cup her face. This is me helping someone I care about. Someone who matters to me. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you'd do the same for anyone you cared about. I know you just promised to put your entire life on hold for Sal because he needs you. I know you're terrified and trying to be brave. His thumbs had brushed away tears Natalie hadn't realized were falling. Let me be brave with you. Natalie had broken. All the fear and stress and overwhelming emotion of the past few hours had crashed over her, and she'd buried her face in Dominic's chest, sobbing. He'd wrapped his arms around her, holding her together while she'd fallen apart. I've got you, he'd murmured into her hair. I've got you, Natalie. They'd stood like that in the hospital parking lot, Natalie crying, Dominic holding her, until she'd had nothing left. When she'd finally pulled back, embarrassed and exhausted, Dominic had produced a handkerchief from his pocket. Who carries handkerchiefs? Natalie had asked, her voice wrecked. Apparently I do. He'd wiped her face with gentle hands. Better. Not really. But thank you. For what? For staying. For not running when things got complicated. Dominic's expression had been unbearably tender. Natalie, I told you, I'm not going anywhere. He'd driven her home, walked her to her door, and kissed her forehead when she clearly couldn't handle anything more. Get some sleep, he'd said. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning, we'll go see Sal, then figure out the diner situation together. You really don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference. After he'd left, Natalie had collapsed on her bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. In the span of 1 week, her carefully controlled life had been completely upended. She'd let a man past her defenses. She'd fallen for someone with terrifying speed. And now she was responsible for keeping Sal's diner running while he recovered from heart surgery. It had been too much. All of it had been too much. But as Natalie had drifted toward sleep, she'd thought about Dominic's steady presence in the hospital, the way he'd held her without expecting anything in return, the way he'd offered to help without making her feel weak for needing it. Maybe, just maybe, letting someone in wasn't the disaster she'd always thought it would be. Maybe it was exactly what she needed. 2 weeks into whatever this was with Dominic Kane, Natalie Palmer had a problem. She was falling. Not the cute, manageable kind of falling where you could still maintain some dignity and emotional distance. No, this was the full-on, lose-your-footing, tumbling down a hill kind of falling that left you dizzy and disoriented and completely out of control. And it was terrifying. The diner had consumed her life. Early mornings that started at 5 a.m., late nights that didn't end until after midnight. Natalie's hands smelled permanently of garlic and dish soap. Her certification program assignments piled up on her tiny kitchen table. She had missed 2 classes already. But Dominic had been there, every single day. He'd shown up that first morning in jeans and a plain black t-shirt, had rolled up his sleeves and asked where to start. Natalie had stared at him, this man who ran a multi-million-dollar company, standing in Sal's cramped kitchen like he belonged there. "I don't know what I'm doing," she'd admitted. "Then we'll figure it out together." And they had. Dominic had learned to work the register, had memorized orders, had even attempted to make pizza, though his first 3 attempts had been, in Natalie's words, crimes against Italian cuisine. "You're supposed to stretch the dough, not strangle it," Natalie had said, laughing despite her exhaustion. "It's fighting back. Because you're being aggressive." Here, she'd moved behind him, her hands covering his, gentle, like this. Dominic had gone very still. "This is not helping my concentration. Focus, Kane. That's what I'm trying to do." They'd fallen into a rhythm. Natalie handling the kitchen, Dominic managing the front. Marco had stopped by twice, had taken one look at his brother wielding a pizza cutter, and had laughed so hard he'd nearly fallen over. "This is the best thing I've ever seen," Marco had said, taking photos. "I'm sending these to the board of directors." "Don't you dare," Dominic had warned, but he'd been smiling. Too late, already sent. But it hadn't all been laughter. There'd been moments of crushing stress. The day the oven had broken, and they'd had to shut down for 4 hours. The morning a supplier had mixed up their order. The evening a customer had complained so loudly that Natalie had locked herself in the bathroom and cried. Dominic had found her there, had sat on the floor outside the door and talked to her through it until she'd come out. "I can't do this," Natalie had said, her voice small. "I'm failing, Sal. I'm failing my classes. I'm failing everything." "You're not failing anything. You're doing something incredibly hard, and you're doing it with grace." "I cried in a bathroom." "Everyone's allowed to cry in bathrooms. That's what bathrooms are for." Despite herself, Natalie had laughed. They'd visited Sal every evening. His surgery had been successful, but recovery was slow. He'd looked a little stronger each day, had started making jokes again, had told increasingly elaborate stories about his days running the diner. And he'd watched Natalie and Dominic with sharp, knowing eyes. "You two," he'd said one evening, waving a hand between them. "This is good. This is real." "Sal," Natalie had protested, her cheeks heating. "Don't Sal me. I see how he looks at you, how you look at him. That's the kind of love that weathers storms, baby girl." Sal had reached for Natalie's hand. "Don't be afraid of it." But Natalie was afraid, terrified actually. Because somewhere between early morning coffee runs and late-night inventory counts, between flour fights in the kitchen and stolen kisses in the storage room, between moments of overwhelming stress and unexpected laughter, Natalie had fallen completely, irreversibly in love with Dominic Kane. And she had no idea what to do about it. It was a Thursday night. The diner had finally closed. Natalie had been wiping down tables while Dominic had counted the register. They'd worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from spending 14 hours a day together. Natalie. She'd looked up. Dominic had been standing by the counter, the register forgotten, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Yeah, I need to tell you something." Natalie's heart had started hammering. "Okay." Dominic had crossed to her, had taken the rag from her hands and set it aside, had taken both her hands in his. I'm falling in love with you, he'd said. And Natalie's entire world had stopped. Actually, that's not true. I've already fallen. I'm in love with you, Natalie Brooks. Completely. Terrifyingly. I'm in love with the way you hum when you're making pizza. The way you remember every regular customer's name and order. The way you cry at sappy commercials but pretend you're not. The way you're brave even when you're scared. The way you... Dominic. He'd stopped. Waited. Natalie had been shaking. Her eyes had been burning with tears she'd been trying desperately to hold back. I'm terrified, she'd whispered. I know. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I. What if I mess it up? Then we'll fix it together. What if you leave? Dominic had cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away tears that had finally spilled over. Natalie, listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not your mother's boyfriend. I'm not some transaction. I'm here. I'm all in. And I'm not leaving. Natalie had looked up at him, at this man who'd held her while she'd cried, who'd learned to make pizza for her, who'd rearranged his entire life without hesitation, who'd somehow seen past every wall she'd built and had decided she was worth the climb. I love you, she'd said. The words had come out broken, terrified but true. I'm already there. I love you too. Dominic's smile had been like sunrise, like something breaking open. And then he'd kissed her. It had been different from every kiss before, deeper, more certain, like a promise and a beginning all at once. When they'd finally pulled apart, both breathless, Dominic had rested his forehead against hers. I have a question, he'd said. Okay. When you said no man has ever touched you, did you mean? Yes, Natalie had whispered, understanding. I meant all of it. Dominic's hands had trembled slightly. Then, when you're ready, when you want, I want to be the first to touch you, really touch you, to know you, all of you. But only when you're ready. There's no rush. Natalie's heart had been so full it had hurt. How did I get so lucky? I'm the lucky one. They had stood there in the empty diner, holding each other, and Natalie had felt something she'd never felt before. Safe. Completely, utterly safe. 6 weeks later, Sal had returned to the diner. He'd looked thinner, a little frailer, but his smile had been as wide as ever. He'd surveyed the dining room, the gleaming counters, the full tables of happy customers, and had turned to Natalie and Dominic with tears in his eyes. You saved it, he'd said. You saved my place. We just kept it warm for you, Natalie had said. No, you made it better. Sal had hugged her tight. Thank you, baby girl. Natalie's certification program had ended the week before. She'd finished top of her class despite everything. Her professors had been amazed when they'd learned what she'd been managing alongside her coursework. And Dominic. Dominic had surprised her. He'd shown up at her apartment one evening with flowers and a nervous energy she'd never seen before. What's wrong? Natalie had asked immediately. Nothing's wrong. Something's very right. He'd pulled out a folder. I have a proposal, a business proposal. Okay. I want to invest in your consulting firm. Not as charity, as a genuine business investment. I've seen what you can do, Natalie. I've watched you turn struggling situations into successes. I believe in you, and I want to help you build your dream. Natalie had stared at him. Dominic. Before you say no, this isn't about us. This is about you being brilliant and deserving a real shot. He'd handed her the folder. Look it over. Talk to a lawyer. Make sure everything's fair, and then decide. Natalie had opened the folder, had seen the terms, the investment amount, the percentage splits. It had all been more than fair. It had been generous. Why? She'd asked. Because I love you. Because I believe in you. Because you deserve someone who sees your potential and wants to help you reach it. And Natalie had realized something. This was what love actually looked like. Not transactions, not conditions, not people who left when things got hard. This was partnership. This was someone who stayed. They'd ended up back where it had all started, on the balcony of Dominic's building. The same balcony where Natalie had made her confession, where Dominic had promised to be her first. The city had glittered below them, exactly as it had that first night, but everything else had changed. Natalie had changed. Still think I'm arrogant? Dominic had asked, pulling her close. Absolutely, Natalie had said, but you're mine. He'd kissed her then, and Natalie had thought about how terrified she'd been that first night, how certain she'd been that letting someone in would destroy her. She'd been wrong. Letting someone in had saved her. The bravest thing you can do, Natalie thought as Dominic held her against the night sky, is let someone see you, all of you, the scared parts, the broken parts, the parts you're certain aren't worth loving. And then trust them to stay anyway. Because sometimes, just sometimes, they do. And sometimes, that changes everything.